Thank you very much for the nice introduction. So I thought in the 20 minutes that I'll have today, we'll focus not so much on the question of who's the patron or who were the draftsmen, but rather focus on the way they were made, the drawings, the 30 drawings that we see in the manuscripts, especially because I think, as most people haven't studied the manuscript for a very long time, I thought it quite useful to show you a little bit how the drawings were made, what can we see, and I was fortunate enough to study the manuscript several times in the Bibermühle, so also being able to take some photography of it, and I hope it will clear up some questions that were also addressed in earlier contributions relating to the way the drawings were made. So just to summarize a little bit what we have already heard about the technical aspects of the manuscripts. So there is this idea that, as Eberhard König said, probably very early in the planning, manuscripts, the miniatures were planned as squared miniatures, which must have been abandoned pretty quickly because others are certainly conceived with a rounded top. Then we have the double page layout, which in the first part of the manuscript, including the Office of the Virgin and the Masses, we have double leaves inserted to create a double page layout, whereas in the suffrages it must have been already planned with double page miniatures for text openings. We have the border decorations that, following Eberhard König's argumentations, were added later in two steps, the ones that dominate the book and then the one border that was added to the opening of the Gospel of St. John. We probably have initials, two types of initials there too. And we have the brownish looking ink drawings that are the most prominent element, I guess, that might be a type of iron gall ink just from visual observation. We haven't done any technical research on it, so everything I'm going to tell you now just comes from observing the drawings, and the brownish appearance of the color comes from the iron and the oxidization process. So that might be what the artist has used here. And what I would like to talk about is how exactly are they done, what can we see, how does it relate to what we might find in the Belles-Heures, and Rob Dukas has already mentioned the infrared reflectography examination of the Belles-Heures and the Metropolitan, and I want to come back to that a little bit, and how unfinished are the unfinished drawings. So what is there a possibility to differentiate within what we actually see? So I've picked this miniature of the Slaughter of the Innocents because that's also that you can see it in several reproductions, and it wasn't a page that was really opened, but you can see when looking closer that we don't only have the ink drawing, but we do have grayish lines that shimmer through as pentimenti that apparently relate to an earlier layout, which is not something uncommon in manuscript illumination, that you see it next to the head of Herodotus, that there is apparently was the head of a soldier drawn with something that looks gray. And as we haven't analyzed it, I would just call it a gray pen. So there was this question of silver point, but silver point usually sticks to a ground that is that has a sort of foundation that must have been with a lead white or a color, whatever, to make the silver point stick. And as these lines look gray, I just speak of a gray pen, as they also don't look fluid to me. And you also see that kind of initial planning or at least some sort of design here, for example, when you have the round, like sort of ball ornament, you have the construction of the architecture running through in the gray pen. In these areas, also parts of the dress that has been underdrawn with this type of pen, and then there is the ink drawing on top of that. And that's just another, with another light coming in a little bit, sort of the attempt of a raking light, just to show you it's very really few deposits of the drawing material here, but I think it's interestingly visible that there is a sort of design that has been laid out, and then when the artist uses the ink to redraw the composition, some things that are changed, left out, and construction lines here that run through the figures. It's actually, for those of you who have seen the little film that was running downstairs that was produced, actually the artist there came quite close to how it was done, because he was drawing the composition in a metal point, some type of metal point, and then he used the ink to reinforce the line. So that's basically the point of what I was going to show you in my first part. And here again another image. Just, I don't know if you really see it better that way, that there's this grayish material, these grayish lines here that show a hand and a sort of dagger or rather sword that was then abandoned in the layout with the ink. Other miniatures and other drawings, and we have heard that, and I think everyone touched on that question in the Passion of Christ, the scene accompanying the hours of the Holy Cross. The use of ink appears a little bit looser, and we do have, for example, areas where the artist redraws several or some lines, sort of reinforcement. So it looks a little bit, it's not one controlled single line, but rather several lines to lead a little bit to conglomeration of ink. But also here we do find a preliminary layout with the gray pen. Here it is used for the cross, and you see it goes over here a little bit. We also have it under here. You can see it. I hope you can see it in the image, and I have the raking light attempt here too. That it's also under the ink. So it is not just for the construction, but also for the entire cross beam here, and you also see it along the back of either Joseph or one of the men who takes down Christ from the cross. And also one interesting detail is that you see that the phylactery where you would have the inscription was first laid out as something that just doesn't move or isn't curled up at the sides, but just goes straight over here. So just few adaptations. Another thing that I have observed, which I found was really interesting, how the architectures are constructed. You find in several places you find that I use this detail here for the castle in the image accompanying the suffrage to St. John the Baptist, that the artist has a sort of vertical fragmentation of the page that he uses as a guideline for where he's going to place architectural elements. He also has this, for example, in the Annunciation, he has it in the center of the vault, which is, it strikes him as an interesting aspect, because it's not indication of a copying method or anything. It's more, it seems to be more something to, or a method to separate or to divide the image up, actually, to use that as a construction means that he's drawing these lines over the entire length of the page, so to say. And on the other hand, he uses, we find instances, we don't observe these kind of under the underdrawing, so to say, in every miniature, but as you can see it here, and there, for example, it almost looks like a dotted line, and that is with the unaided eye, it could be either a drying material, or it's the question which we can't answer by just looking at it with the naked eye, is how much deposit of material is left. But in the Princess, for example, you see that you have this line here too, at least around the shoulder, and in the lower part of the miniature here, you also see it in the folds of her garment. So I just chose this detail to show you that also architecture. There's a sort of first layout of subdividing the page to prepare it for the architecture, and then there are elements both in architecture and in figures underdrawn in this first gray pen, I call it at this point, before it is reinforced with now brownish looking ink, which might be iron gall ink. We don't know. In some places that was also observed, again, where the double pages face, there seems to be a different degree to which the miniatures are worked out, a different use of ink for contouring, where here it is a very fine, well, it's mostly defined by very fine and straight lines, and then you have this interesting cross-hatching that creates the depth. You don't have anything of that in this miniature. In this drawing. And here again you see that's a little bit the point of, I'm trying to show you examples where we find the preparatory drawing under the preparatory underdrawing. Here again the construction lines that run through. Here too, and here we don't see it in the photograph, but I suspect that's one of these cases where we don't really know is just material lost or is it something that wasn't there. Here you can see that, and as well the bed of the catafalque, where you see that some of the lines preparing the cloth put over the catafalque are still visible, and here it's just one detail to show you that there's a slight adjustment. It's not really something that alters the meaning of the image, but it somehow shows that the artist thought about the composition and getting everything in order from the first pen drawing to the ink drawing. All right, here to show you the detail. Here again, the console was conceived a little bit differently first, and in the facing image, we have exactly the same working method, that you have the construction lines that run through the entire choir screen, and the figures drawn over that. Here again, slight adjustments, so the entire composition laid out first, or what we see here laid out with the gray pen. I do want to attempt to compare it with what Rob Dickus has already noted, the infrared reflectographies of the Belzer that have been done, just to I don't want to attempt too much with that. So there are certain things that are unclear, and Rob Dickus has already mentioned it, when the drawing materials have been analyzed. As far as I know, Margaret Lawson couldn't reach any conclusion because the materials were just the quantities were too small, so we don't know what it is. And the problem with iron gall ink is we can't really show it in infrared reflectography. Now I hear from Stella Panayotova and her team, maybe it is possible. They're doing quite an interesting project in Cambridge at the moment, trying to, bring these questions. So it's another problem there. With the things that Margaret Lawson has published, and also that Rob Dickus touched on, are we sure what's on top, what's below? Maybe materials can be used for both for underdrawing and then for elaboration on the top folds. So I'm only going to point out things we don't see on the painted surface, and sort of additions to the main miniatures, and look at what we see there. For example, in this miniature with Saint Jerome, who's pulling the thorn out of the paw of the lion, and the corresponding infrared image. And I have a detail which I wanted to show you. And we know very little of these things, so maybe the observation is not that spectacular. But in the construction of the fountain on the right-hand side, we do see the use of these page-dividing vertical lines that, and again, a little alteration here that looks different from what we see in the painted stage, but these kind of constructive lines that subdivide the page vertically and then insert the architectural structure to be painted then, and this is sort of an architectural structure, the fountain as it is made here, inserted to that. It strikes me as at least a very comparable working technique, and as I said, we know very little about. We have Jonathan Alexander. He has not observed something like that. Maybe the future will bring that. That is not so uncommon. It's an interesting aspect of how to create the architectural elements in the miniatures. Another miniature that we have already seen is Saint Jerome in his with the lion in his library. Here again, a detail of the underdrawing of the architecture, where we, for example, see here lines running through, so sort of geometrical from an abstract to the detail, if you so will. Some alterations in the way the vaults are done, and just to make you a little bit accustomed to what we're seeing here. For example, the books. It's difficult to judge whether it's something dry or fluid. Here, for the books, it looks rather fluid, and I think what Margaret Lawson was also at least compelled to say is that there was a combination of both media. What we don't see here in the walls, that is, this hatching here is from the paint. Everything carbon containing, shows up in infrared, and this, what we see here and might mistake for hatching, most likely comes from the paint that is applied on the top. We don't see the intense cross-hatching that we observe in some of the architectural elements in the manuscript. There's just no indication that something like that would have been the case in the underdrawings of the Belles-Heures. Let us just keep that thought for a second, and just another example that also in some of the miniatures you see larger alterations concerning the first underdrawing and then the execution of the figures in paint. It's just, I don't really want to, Margaret Lawson has separated three hands, and I don't really want to say or totally agree. I don't want to comment on that. I just used this one painter that's interestingly the elegant hand as an example where you find these kind of alterations. And the things that I've looked through from the material is that in others this is not that evident, which doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not, was just not evident in photographs. So the dense square hatching, we are not quite sure if maybe in the case of the Annunciation miniature there might also be washes of color in the darkest area. It's quite tricky to observe. It is very well possible, but you see that mostly the impression of depth is created by the hatches, and very nice regular cross hatches here, varied to thicker, looser, a little bit tighter, and it creates this enormous impression of depth. And as we have heard talk about the drawings that are still visible in the Annunciation, I thought I'd look a little bit at how this is done. So we do have, again, this is one of these central vertical lines that I was talking about, which he uses to construct the architecture, apparently. This is apparently an underdrawing for, might be, a column like this that wasn't then executed with ink. Here we do have construction lines for the floor. This is a slight wash that might relate to something else, which I'll show you in a minute. And the interesting thing about the question of is this the first thing, in the middle, second, is that these construction lines that you see here for the tiles run through and actually frame the entire image space of the Annunciation. So I would believe that this is the only thing that remains of the first pen drawing, and then the artist started with elaborating with ink the architecture, which was obviously very much of interest to him, and might have even developed it to a degree that it lifted it above the idea of just having an underdrawing. Just another image of, so you can see a little bit the quality of the drawing. I think it's a pen. It doesn't really look very liquid, where it might be a different case over here, but here again you see the lines running through. These are the construction lines that I was talking about. It's not the justification. It's used to lay out the space for both the miniature and the border. This is something a little bit coarser, and here you also have a wash. I'm not quite sure when that, or we don't know when that was applied, whether that belongs to an attempt of starting, starting to color in the image, or whether it was something that the artist himself already did. It looks a little bit like something later. Whereas here in these kind of areas, there might be use of wash to reinforce the deepening effect of the cross-hatching in the architecture. So an idea could be, or just to make the discussion a little bit more complicated, that while the artist was working and underdrawing the miniatures, at some point he developed something that went far beyond an underdrawing, which might have added to the reason why it was never finished. If the borders were finished, let's say 10 years or something like that, after the manuscript was abandoned, 5 or 10 years, why wasn't the manuscript completed? Because that would still be a time frame where you would find that something usual. Maybe it has something to do with this kind of quality that is not the same everywhere. And I come back, and I think this might be a possibility that when we compare these two images that are facing images, and Eberhard König introduced that is an inserted double leaf, as is the left side of the Annunciation at the opening of the Office of the Virgin Mary, and we do look at how these are constructed. Principally, you have the lines shaping or creating the layout for the basic form, and you have the facing image with hatches that creates an entirely different spatial effect. Maybe this is not so. I mean, it could be that there's this one draftsman who, from something like that, which is not as it is fine. It's a fine line. It's not really something that compares to when we look at grisaille paintings, for example, at the time, or lavish pen drawings, and whether this is a step of evolution in the planning of the manuscript and the execution of the manuscript. That might explain what makes pages as the Annunciation so tricky to judge in terms of, is it finished, is it unfinished, or it is unfinished, but is it developing into something that could remain unfinished? And I would just like to end with an observation, which might be interesting for the discussion. The idea, of course, would be that something as elaborate as this develops from conceiving a pen drawing from an underdrawing, or developing that into something that could be autonomous, and how that relates to maybe Italian sources in drawing. It's just something that has been discussed, that I think would be worth looking at, comparing to what we know of Altichiero, for example, and in Milan in the Giovannino dei Grassi circle. It's not the same. It's a very different kind of drawing, but the idea of also Pisanello, the ink drawings, that the way that they are made, how they are made, the visual effect, the visual quality that they have, and just is one. I don't know if anyone has has noticed that on my last visit in Florence. It's a San Landini de Landini, right? An epitaph, which is dated 1397, and has in the upper part such an interesting detail, which, if you go back, and then there you have the little angel sitting, and it's fittingly the tombstone of a musician, an artist, and also these kind of materials that's acanthus flowers that are squeezed into these kind of cornerstones. So that might be an interesting aspect for the question: if and when the Limburgs went to Italy, and that things like that might have been already around much earlier than 1415. Thank you very much for your attention.